Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Integrating Conservation Practices into Lease Agreements. My name is Julia Freuk. I am the project coordinator here at the Partnership for Ag Resource Management and will be hosting the webinar this morning. We are joined today by Jennifer Filipiak, Midwest Regional Director for the American Farmland Trust, who will provide a brief introduction on AFT. I'm also pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Gary Wright, Farm Management Specialist at Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. Before we begin, I will go over some brief logistics. Please make use of the question box on your screen to type questions for Gary during his presentation. I will moderate the questions during the last 10 to 15 minutes of the webinar after the presentation. We suggest viewing the webinar while connected via Ethernet for best audio quality performance. You will receive an email in the next few days with the webinar recording and a webinar evaluation. The recording will also be available on partnershipfarm.org. By attending today's webinar, you are eligible for 1.5 CCA continuing education units, 1 for nutrient management and 0.5 for professional development. You must be present for the entire webinar to receive those points. If you submitted your CCA number at registration and are watching the webinar live, no further action is required to submit your CEUs. If you are watching this on demand at a later date, please be sure to watch the entire presentation through the GoToWebinar platform and not YouTube to receive credit. You must submit your CCA number at registration to receive CEUs. If you watch the webinar recording more than 2 weeks after the original broadcast, please email julia@partnershipfarm.org your CCA number to ensure your credits are submitted. Please make a big note that credits often take a few weeks to appear in your account. If it has been more than 3 weeks, please contact my email. And now, with the logistics taken care of, I will provide a quick introduction to the Great Lakes Conservation Connect project. Great Lakes Conservation Connect is a collaborative partnership of conservation agencies focused on engaging both women non-operator landowners and farmer tenants to work together to increase conservation practices on their land. Why women? Because we have a successful model to engage them and research shows they are interested. We'll hear more about that in a minute. Really, we're starting with women, but much of what we're learning applies to all non-farming landowners. A key component to our goal is increased communication between the farmer and landowner to enable leasing structures that make it easier for farmers to try new practices. In order for farmers and landowners to see the benefits of implemented conservation practices and continue to invest, it is necessary to extend leases beyond 1 year. According to the USDA's Economic Research Service, more than 54% of U.S. cropland is currently rented. Many landowners can be removed from agriculture, unaware of the risks of depleting soil health and practices that exacerbate runoff. We need to provide outreach to both landowners and tenants now more than ever as the percentage of rented lands continues to rise. Great Lakes Conservation Connect is working towards our goal of increased beneficial practices on rented lands by providing resources for developing lease agreements, such as this webinar, communication and education strategies, and working one-on-one with farmers and landowners in Ohio and New York through learning circles and workshops. Our goal is to scale up the project to other states within the Great Lakes Basin. The Partnership for Ag Resource Management, or PARM, a project of the IPM Institute, is working to engage retailers in providing resources to their clientele to help integrate beneficial practices on rented lands. Helping customers access resources to start conversations with their landowners means selling additional products and services like cover crops, variable rate technology, or subsurface fertilizer application on increased acres. With extended lease terms, you can secure your clientele for a longer period. We have created a brochure for ag retailers as a handout for their customers. Order several now and pass them out at your next grower meeting. Contact Julia at partnershipfarm.org to get yours today. Lastly, to access additional information, visit the Farmland Information Center. And now, I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer Filipiak, Midwest Regional Director of American Farmland Trust, who will provide a brief introduction on AFT's role in Great Lakes Conservation Connect.
Good morning, everyone. As Julia said, my name is Jen Filipiak, and I lead AFT's programming in the Midwest region. I'm just going to very, very briefly tell you who AFT is. We are a national nonprofit organization. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C., but we have regional offices, 6 regional offices across the country. And you can see our mission there. We were founded in 1980 primarily in response to an alarming rate of development on farmland. So we really started with protecting farm and ranch land, and we now have a 3-pronged mission to not just protect the land from development, but also to promote sound farming practices, so we know that it can be managed and produce food, fiber, and fuel well into the future, and also keep farmers on the land. We recognize we haven't really protected farmland if farmers can't be profitable. So that is our mission. Our role in this project, we are the lead applicant for the funding for this project. We are doing this under a generous grant from the Great Lakes Protection Fund, and AFT is managing that grant, and we serve as the lead coordinating all the partners on this project. Next slide, please. So one of the main things I'm going to talk about a little bit, because it's unique, we're doing outreach in parallel with farmers and with landowners and retailers to increase conservation on rented ground. That's the main goal of this project, is to figure out different ways to help get more conservation on rented ground. And we're using, you can click all the way through 2 more times, Julia, to get everything up there. Oh, and back 1, thank you. And we're using, one model that we're using is kind of a new model. It's unique, but it's well tested. It's been going on in Iowa since 2009, developed by the Women Food and Agriculture Network. And I've been working with this model since 2012 through AFT in multiple states, primarily in Indiana and Illinois, but in multiple states around the country. And this learning circle model is a way to engage women, non-operating landowners, in conservation. There's a lot of survey work out there that says they're interested in these things, but there's also a lot of data out there showing that they are very underrepresented in programs and technical and financial assistance programs for conservation. So we bring them together in a very standard adult learning environment, which is the peer-to-peer learning model. It's the framework where we all have something to share and we all have something to learn. And we found that this works especially well with women. They really enjoy engaging, connecting with each other, and learning from each other. When we host these learning circles, they're an all-day event. There's a morning technical discussion that can range all different kinds of topics, always conservation. It could be soil health. It could be, I've spent a whole morning talking about the nitrate cycle. And so we don't shy away from very technical topics. We find that the women are eager to learn. They're very interested in how farming is now. We have conservation and agricultural professional staff participate in the discussion, but you can see from the picture there, we do try and keep it very non-hierarchical. There's no head of the table, there's no PowerPoint, there's no lecturing. It's very interactive, lots of demonstrations. These meetings are without men, generally, for the first part of the day. I've had men join us in the first part of the day in different circumstances, but generally they're without men for the first part of the day. Really, the women really appreciate that, and they ask for that. It gives them a chance to ask their quote-unquote stupid questions, which they do not have stupid questions. They have really good questions, and gets them comfortable, with the topic and asking questions. In the afternoon, we go out on a field tour. We meet farmers. We look at conservation practices. We talk to farmers and landowners together. So that's the learning circle model. You can go to the next slide. We know that this this model works, we have data now on this model that if when we host a learning circle, we know that up to 70% of the women that attend these learning circles do take a conservation action after attending a learning circle. Primarily, that conservation action is something as simple as they ask their farmer what kinds of practices he's doing on the farm ground. It helps basically start conversation between the farmer and the landowner, which we feel is really important if the landowner is going to contribute to sharing risk to try new conservation practices on the rented land. So I've been doing these learning circles since 2012. I did a tally recently, and I've talked to, through the learning circle, I've talked face-to-face with over 450 women landowners, mostly in the Midwest. And these are my impressions. These are themes that I hear over and over again. They're very hungry for this knowledge. They want to know more about their land, about farming in general, what farming's like now. A lot of the women that attend are maybe they grew up on the farm, but they're not farming anymore, and they say things like, it's not the same as when I grew up, and they're very interested in understanding the constraints on the farmer and just what it's like to be in farming today. The third and fourth bullet are the really key ones for our work in this project, which is they really truly have a deep respect and trust for their farmer, the person that is renting their land. They view him as the expert. He is the farmer. They are not farmers. And so they look to him for guidance, for advice, for his opinions on how best to manage that land. And they care very deeply that the land is managed well. And they trust that their farmer will do that and will bring things up to them if there's issues. They want to talk with their farmer more, but they also don't want to burden him. They know there's a lot of time. It's not easy being a farmer. There's a lot coming at him, and they're very aware of that, and they don't want to be a burden. And this bullet about all the chemicals, the women that come to these learning circles, they're not necessarily wanting to go, full organic or non-GMO or anything like that. It's more that they have seen an increasing trend in the use of chemicals and synthetic fertilizers, and they're curious about that. They want to know why that's happening, and they're wondering if there's a way to back off on that. And what that really tells me is if you're a farmer renting rented land and you want to do something like, say, variable rate technology, your landowner is probably very interested in talking to you about that. So that's an opportunity for farmers. The other thing, too, these women, when they inherit the farmland, they inherit the farm, they inherit the farmer, and they inherit the lease. And it doesn't really occur to them that they could actually change that lease. And by changing the lease, it not only benefits them, it could benefit their farmer too. There's lots of verbal leases out there still. So just going from a verbal to a written lease could be a real benefit for both parties. And it doesn't occur to them that they can do that, because it's just something they inherited. So we'll go to the next slide. We do have a research project underway. We're surveying non-operating landowners, all genders, in 11 different states, 11 of the highest rented states in the United States, and including Ohio and New York, which are the two states we're working on for this project. And we have some preliminary data back yet. This project is underway, and we'll be publishing and releasing information about this later in the spring and into the early summer, because we're right in the middle of it. But we do have some preliminary data back from the I states, Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. And these are some of the things we're seeing from our survey. Again, agreeing with this idea that the landowner is very interested in talking about farming practices and maybe more open to change and investing in things that are good for the land than the farmer might think. Again, they trust their farmer. That is coming out very strong in the responses that we're getting from these surveys. They're interested in conservation. They're comfortable. They say, I'm absolutely comfortable changing my lease terms if it'll help my land. And we're finding there's lots of crop share leases out there, maybe more than we thought, at least in Illinois and Indiana. Lots of verbal lease agreements. Majority of these leases are annual term, but the next question we ask them is, how long have you been renting to the same operator? And in the 3I states, that's averaging about 16, 17 years to the same operator on an annual term lease. So these are long-term relationships. There's opportunities there. Next slide. So my final slide, just describing the project a little, bringing it back to what we're doing in New York and Ohio with this great group of partners we have. All this information we have about women landowners, we just feel like if we can really invest in that relationship and help both parties have good discussions, good relationships, good communicative relationships, we could potentially see more improvements on rented land. So we're doing parallel work with farmers, farmer meetings on relationship building and retaining rented land, you know, selling yourself to the landowner. How do you keep the land that you're renting? Farmers are always worried about that in a highly competitive environment. And then we haven't really created a lot new because there's a lot of really good information out there already on these kinds of issues, these relationship issues in leasing. But there's a lot of it. It's all over the place, and it's kind of hard to find. So we're trying to create collections. We're calling them toolkits, and we're housing them on our Farmland Information Center. And just briefly, and you'll get these links too at the end, but briefly about the Farmland Information Center, that's a national resource for information about farmland protection and stewardship, and it's a partnership between AFT and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So there's information specialists that are employed by the FIC, the Farmland Information Center. They analyze key data sources, they track farmland protection activity, and so the website itself is very rich. There's a lot there. It offers a comprehensive collection of resources about farm and rangeland protection, on-farm conservation, ag viability, and more. Fact sheets, articles, reports, local and federal legislative updates, and lots of statistics, especially from the Natural Resources Inventory and the Census of Agriculture. So that's a resource that might be of use to you, not just the two links that I provided there on the bottom of your screen there. So with that, Julia, I'll turn it back to you. That's our introduction.
Thank you, Jen. Before we begin the presentation, I have a few brief PARM announcements. Our regular PARM webinar series continues January 23rd with a presentation on nitrogen rate research to improve profitability and water quality. The second Great Lakes Conservation Connect webinar airs February 4th and will discuss who owns and rents American farmland. Please note that we take into consideration your suggestions for webinar topics, so be sure to fill out our evaluation form after the webinar. For all egg retailers in attendance today, don't forget to take PARM's 2018 Season Egg Retailer Survey. This survey is vital for our egg industry and your location. Look for the survey link in our follow-up email or on our website. Please be sure to take only one survey per egg retailer branch or location by January 22nd. By participating in the survey, you will receive an individual report detailing your phosphorus and nitrogen loss reductions from specific products and services, along with an aggregate report that incorporates all survey respondent data. Names and locations are kept anonymous. We also invite you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for PARM updates and industry news. Now, we'll get the presentation started with Gary Wright, Farm Management Specialist at Iowa State University Extension and Outreach.
Good morning, Jen, Julia. Thank you both for those introductions and the information that we're going to talk about further now. I'm the Farm Management Specialist for Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. I'm actually a Northwest Iowa native, and I am based in Northwest Iowa. I will be talking today about the perspective in the state of Iowa, primarily because of where I spend most of my time. I'm also a farmer in Northwest Iowa, so I have the practical experiences that relates to the lease discussion that we're going to have as well. The bottom line, the purpose, as I was contacted to talk about this topic, again, the idea is to improve the landowner-tenant relationship as it relates to a lease arrangement, and that's the premise of where we're going to talk about. But then introducing to that, just the need to also talk about conservation as it relates to that very important business decision. In terms of logistics,
One second, Gary, can you share your screen with us so we can see your slides?
Sorry, I see it. I haven't changed my first slide, but
there we go.
Is that better?
Yep.
Thank you. And again, I am familiar with the chat box with use of the webinar. So as people have questions for me, I'm going to try to keep it very informal. feel free, if there's a topic that we're talking about, to go ahead and shove a chat box question my way, and I'll try to see it and respond to it. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end if there's anything that's best for that. Again, my best guess is we'll probably spend about the next 30 minutes together. I believe it's close to 10:30 or 10:20 right now, and I'll try to be done by roughly 10:20 or 10:55, excuse me, Central Time. Again, the other thing I want to make reference to is my last slide, and I won't go there right now. There's a reference list. I obviously working for Iowa State University. I have the privilege of being associated with a lot of colleagues. In addition, there's several other references that I made in terms of with the information that I put together for these slides. So I'll just make reference to that when I get to that point at the end. Again, I would offer again, I really welcome your feedback if you have any questions, and then certainly I think, as Jen and Julia mentioned, if you have a feedback opportunity at the end, please give me your feedback, because I do want to try to get better at this each time I do it. So I appreciate any feedback you'd give me. So with that, there's kind of the agenda for today, and I think now you can all see that. We're going to talk about, again, introductions. We've already dispensed of that. I'm going to just go into a little bit of conservation discussion, just because I think everybody knows what we're talking about in that regard, but I'm going to focus in on soil, water, and crop conservation. We could talk about some other points of conservation, but we're going to talk about those three just because of our time today. In that case, they'll carry, and we'll have most of the topic covered. I am not an attorney, and you'll probably hear me say that a couple different times. In the state of Iowa, it is not lawful to practice law if you're not an attorney. So I wanted to premise that right away with my remarks. At the same time, we get very, very close to legal matters when it relates to leasing. And so I'm going to talk about it from the standpoint of a practitioner side of it, using a lease, helping people making decisions with leases, and as I'm out there one-on-one with individuals, or having educational sessions like this, but it'll strictly be from the standpoint of a non-attorney perspective. Then we're going to talk about the lease supplement, again, kind of a special document that's associated with, and again, I do emphasize, much as Jenna's already talked about, I really am a firm believer in a written lease, and there is a place for documentation to include then conservation language, and so we will talk about that. And I'll summarize my remarks when we get toward the end, and then again, if you have questions that you did not answer or ask earlier, certainly we'll offer an opportunity for those questions to be asked at that time as well. And then again, as I mentioned, just the reference thing when I get to that slide. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk just briefly. I'm not a scientist. The other thing I guess I failed to mention to you, my background is economics, is business decision making. I'm fortunate again to have in Northwest Iowa by itself, we have two agronomists that are well schooled in the sciences. And so as it relates to conservation then, and some of my references talked about other folks, we're going to talk just enough about it from the standpoint of to kind of define what we're talking about. Certainly we're going to talk about soil conservation, we're going to talk about water conservation, and we're going to talk about crop conservation. We could have talked about, wind, we could have talked about sunshine conservation, we could have talked about some other things, but at this point we're going to focus on soil, water, and crops. Sorry about that. My screen got ahead of me. I don't know where that came from for sure. Soil conservation, again, just again, that definition, you have it up in the slide in front of you. Again, think in terms of the soil, the water, and the crops themselves, all within keeping of one another. The commonality is it's an asset. It's an asset to the landowner. It's an asset to the tenant. And so what we're talking about is conserving that asset in a way that's to the benefit of everyone, whether it be short-term or long-run. So obviously the first one then is as we know, soil. It's the natural resource that forms the foundation of the whole ecosystem. Again, it filters, decomposes, stores, exchanges. Without the soil, that crop producer is going to have a hard time producing any sort of crop that will have any success associated with it. The second one, water conservation. Again, our remarks later, we got talking about leases, and some of the lease items that we're going to talk about relate to both soil and water conservation. Obviously, water then, we know that it's the source of abundance. Life doesn't happen without water. Obviously, there's all kinds of other benefits that water provide to us in the areas of transportation. We know that, and then, but certainly from a crop standpoint, from an ag lease standpoint, it's very difficult to have a productive farm outcome without water. And so we want to talk about conserving that very, very important asset. And then the last one, crop conservation. I'll just, it sounds like a little bit of how does that differentiate itself from the water and the soil? I'll just say this, we're talking about more the farm practices, I guess, associated with conservation. It's more the abilities, the decisions that are made. The precision ag is kind of the word that's used now. It defines what we do in terms of producers to be able to make the farming operation successful. And again, as it relates very specifically to conservation today is why we're talking about as it relates to the lease agreement. Certainly it relates to both because of in Northwest Iowa, as well as I think we could say Midwest in general. Again, Northwest Iowa, if you're familiar at all with Highway 60, you get west of Highway 60 and you still have quite a few livestock. The livestock industry is pretty strong. Certainly dairy, et cetera. You get east of Highway 60 in Northwest Iowa, again, you're primarily in a row crop. But the point is, when it relates to crop, the asset of crop farming, the actual, what you do with crop conservation could very much be interrelated to with what you're doing with both your animal and your plant productivity decisions. So for those of you, and again, I think Jen made a reference to, times are tough right now. The complexity of the farming operation, things are maybe more complex today because of the situation with margins. It is right now, it is true to be said that we do know that we are seeing an increase in yields. Productivity is improving, and so it's pretty easy when you think about the margin environment we're in that we maybe don't focus as much on the long term. We don't focus as much as conservation, but it makes a lot of sense to be doing that. And I'm going to really try to oversimplify why it makes sense, even in the environment where we are seeing yields increasing. Why it could be easy to say, well, let's just not worry about that decision. It's too complex. Let's worry about something else. Give you a very simplified economic reasons why perhaps you do want to worry about that. First thing to think about is soil organic matter. Is the fertility associated with being able to be productive, for the soil to be productive. If you do not have organic matter, the soil is not going to be as productive. Certainly, if you lose organic matter with your practices, you're in a position where you can try to overcome that a little bit with some fertility decisions. But obviously, the fertility decisions that cost money, as all inputs have a cost. And so there's a reason why we would want to try to keep in place the organic matter that might be naturally out there through the process of conservation practices and just our precision ag farming that we do. Okay, so that, again, kind of look at that from the standpoint of both short-run economics as well as long-term relationships. Again, there's that OM, or organic matter, again, very simplified. But if you think in terms of that, organic matter makes up roughly 5% of the soil. So on a 2,000 pound ton, you're going to have roughly 100 pounds of organic matter, roughly 5%. The going rate, I chatted with a couple of folks in this area that provide, they're selling actually the dairy and poultry industry and the cattle and hog industries. There's manure that's being sold. Using a general rule of thumb, because I can do the math as well, is roughly 10 cents a pound. So that results in that organic matter, if there's roughly 100 pounds of it per ton, you're talking about roughly $10 a ton in terms of value of what you're getting. So not making decisions that are going to control the erosion, it's certainly a cost run. It's a cost decision that's very applicable to, again, back to this situation regarding margins that we just talked about. But beyond that, long run, certainly as both the tenant getting the most productivity out of the land as well as the owner of the land, at the end of the day, the land itself is only valued because it has the ability to produce. So when we talk about real estate values, That's what we're talking about there. There has to be productivity for the land to have value. And in the state of Iowa, again, if you're familiar at all with the CSR2, the Crop Suitability Rating 2 number, that's a factor across the state of Iowa that allows us to kind of value land from the northeast to the southwest corners of the state with some degree of commonality in terms of the science or the definition behind it. And in the state of Iowa, again, in northwest Iowa specifically, you can relate the CSR2 then to both values of the land itself as well as what the lease rate value might be. Again, just comparatively speaking, in northwest Iowa, and again, these numbers are easy to look at because I can do the math in my head, but don't quote these. There's survey information out there that'll quantify this exactly for you to do the math. But if you take a $10,000 piece per acre piece of real estate in northwest Iowa, and the top CSR2 by definition is 100, that relates to roughly a $10 per acre per CSR point is the value of that acre of real estate. On the lease side, if you take a $300 lease rate and you divide that again by 100, you're talking about roughly $3 per CSR2 point for that lease dollar. So there's a commonality between the productivity of that land, the value of that land, and what the leases and what the value and the sales values would how they would be computed. Beyond that, long run, obviously, we talked about this from the standpoint of conservation, but water quality. How much water, we're talking about certainly drinking water from some perspective, keeping track of what's going into the water that we are drinking. And so long run, would make certain from the standpoint of conserving water, using practices on the soil to be able to keep our water quality. It's all about health. And then beyond that, as I mentioned earlier, we've got, there's other human components to food that relate to water, that relate to what we raise on the land as well as what we grow on the land. And then the big picture right now is we probably all are familiar with what's going on with tariffs and trade and export. There's a lot of, it's not a case where the economics of American ag is domestic. It's certainly very much influenced by exports. And so we've got to be aware of the long run relationship from the standpoint of, well, how are we doing in the world? Are we competitive or not? And how does that relate to the decisions we're making with not only buying and selling land, leasing land, but also then the conservation decisions that we're making within those business decisions. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I also want to talk about, again, the lease basic part of the conversation today. And what I'm talking about is I want to kind of define it into kind of three major areas, kind of the best practices, which are generally going to be supported by the law. Then I'm going to get into, again, I'm not an attorney. We're going to talk about some legal elements that I want to talk about just briefly. And then I want to make reference to what's called the Center for Ag Law and Taxation, which is a group that I'm associated with at Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. It's made up of attorneys that can provide some additional legal background to some of the points that I'm making if somebody would have those kind of questions that they would want to pursue. So the first step we're going to take is just think about just the best practices. I think it's quoted in some of the data that was earlier provided, and it's consistent within the state of Iowa. 53% of the Iowa land in 2017 now, 53% of it was leased. That means that somebody else is farming it other than who owns it. And the way to look at that number is to the Iowa, to commerce in Iowa, I guess you'd say it. That decision is a major piece of what's going to happen in Iowa. The leasing decision is a large fact. The farm lease certainly is an agreement. It's a business contract, much like buying a car or making other decisions related to owning a home. It's an agreement. Today's world with farming, especially as it relates to some of the things we've already talked about, it is very much not a one size fits all. Matter of fact, we even have a type of lease agreement now that's called a flex lease, because by definition, it can be in a variety of forms depending on what the kind of risk you're trying to share between the landlord and the tenant and what you're trying to do. At the end of the day, the farm lease is an agreement that's trying to understand or haven't reached an understanding of who's going to use the land, who's going to occupy the land, and certainly who's going to own the land, with the landowner obviously being the one party to the lease agreement. It's a binding contract. What's been talked about already is there are a lot of leases that as I'm interacting with people that are still not in writing. We believe at Iowa State University Extension that best practices would be that lease would be in writing. And there are, in fact, some reasons why you would want to do that. And I'll talk about that in just a second. Again, the idea behind the farm lease, what it's trying to do is it's trying to join together some of what the law says and what the practices are going to be with that land. So let's talk just for a second about the idea of handshakes. I get into a lot of conversations with individuals, and whether it's a one-on-one session or in a group session like this, where we still have folks, and I do believe in a trusting relationship. I do believe in handshakes. I do believe a person's word should be worth something. The idea today is with the number of changes it seems like we're experiencing with the tenants. I mean, earlier I think Jen did quote, there's a lot of landlord-tenant relationships that are long-term. But in environment today, we are seeing, I think because of the margins, because of other things, we are seeing more and more changes being made. Because of issues where people don't necessarily physically live here, they maybe have not been associated with agriculture. There's a reason why you want to use something in writing versus something verbally. There certainly are legal reasons why you want to have it in the form of writing versus just something verbally. There's certainly very much both binding contracts, whether it is in writing or verbally. But it's not necessarily, there are some limitations where you're going to want to perhaps have it in writing, and I certainly recommend it. Iowa State University recommends that you use something in writing, put it into writing. Okay. Now what I'm going to talk about is from just some best practices, and it's all about the idea of having a relationship. You want to have a productive relationship between you and the tenant. Again, it's a case of the tenant and the landlord being the primarily relationship you're talking about, although in today's environment, because of trust, because of corporations, there might be an entity that's involved with that relationship. Obviously, at the end, it'll be at some point it'll be an individual, but also there could be an entity relationship that we're talking about. We're talking about trying to come up with relationships or practices that are win-win. Again, the trust word appears there again. Whether certainly the handshake doesn't misplace the handshake and needing to trust one another, but also it's going to put it into writing. That way, if there are any changes that happen with individuals, one of the pieces of data that we did not share yet is the age of the people both farming and as the people in Iowa that are owning the land. There is going to be some changes made just because of simple mortality, and so that's another reason why perhaps having something in writing makes a lot more sense versus doing something verbally. You don't have to rely on memory. You don't have to rely upon uncertainties related to that, but if you have something in writing. And then the last thing I just as it relates to the relationship a little bit, during the course of the year, we're talking about even the shortest lease, which is 1 year. You're talking about that's a crop year. If you know anything about weather in Iowa, we had an incredible last roughly crop year. If you go back 6 or 8 months ago, we had everything we could want in Northwest Iowa this last year. So a lot of things can change, and it's certainly not predictable from the standpoint of weather. Beyond that, the markets certainly are a reason why things can change. And so the idea is that if you have a lease document in place to start with, it might make it easier to deal with if there has to be any modifications or corrections that are made along the way. It doesn't mean that you're suggesting that you're going to be changing things haphazardly, but it's giving you a foundation perhaps to move forward as a starting point to look at things that might need to be changed because of the environment we're in. Let's talk a little bit about, again, we're talking about the relationship now, effective communication. Again, the idea behind this is because the size of the farms are getting larger, the number of landowners that are living outside of, maybe never lived on the farm at all, and certainly in some cases don't even live in the Midwest anymore. So there's some diversity going on there that's maybe makes it the need for regular reporting, and which is again ultimately the part of communication that needs to be happening, and that may take the form today of a lot different than what it used to be in the past. Again, I can remember growing up, it would not be unusual where you would know the landlord and the tenant. That could be somebody that's across the fence line from one another, maybe even grew up together, rode the school bus together. But now it could be a situation where they don't even see each other, maybe. And again, from my perspective, I think there is still a lot of positives in having a personal meeting at least once a year, if at all possible, between the landlord and the tenant. And I actually believe there's places for having more than one meeting. If it's possible to physically be together 3 or 4 times a year, I think it's a positive thing. But in today's environment, because of what we're dealing with, it's also taking the form of emails. It's taking the form of letters where you communicate with one another. But again, the point is you're not going to hopefully be doing it just one time a year. You're going to be perhaps having communication again 2, 3, 4 times a year. And again, farming works out well from that standpoint because you've got typically the kind of the pre-plant stage, you've got the growing stage, and then you've got the harvest stage. So you got kind of naturally 3 to 4 times when things are kind of changing as it relates to that farming decision and the farming activities that are going on. It certainly is, because of what we just talked about, there's a place for education to happen, both from the tenant standpoint as well as the landlord standpoint. If you're in a situation where the landlord has not been in a position where they've been around farming, there's a place where ag concepts are going to want to be talked about. And it's not a case of trying to cause anyone to be misled at all. It's just a case of bringing a certain level of basic understandings of what the ag concepts are. Again, farming, as mentioned earlier, it's very complex. It's in a situation where it does have a lot of working parts to it. So the help is going to be as much educated you can go involved with it. Even a landlord that farmed all their life, things are changing enough with things like certifications of pesticides and precision ag. Even those kind of things are changing enough, even for somebody that perhaps farmed their whole life, that they'll want to be kept kind of as much up to speed, and or for the first time maybe being familiar with some basic ag concepts. The tenant's perspective is just as important as the landlord's. Is there anything going on from the tenant perspective? You know, right now, again, they're trying to make a living largely. They're farming because they're trying to make a living. Margins are tight. Is there something that portion, their perspective, you need to be understood? Are there limitations associated with it? Perhaps limitations are in the form of, right now we're in an environment where, unless you are financially able to finance your entire farming operation, you've got bank meetings that are going on right now as it relates to the upcoming spring. Well, that sometimes can be limitations and associated with somebody's balance sheet. Somebody's cash flow is going to make some decisions that's going to perhaps affect what that tenant can or can't do. And again, one of the things that I run into fairly often is and this is a kind of a distinctive point, is again, I started with farm credit in the 1980s, and I'm pretty sure that back then it's the same as what it is now. Banks don't establish what cash rent rates are going to do. Banks are going to make decisions based on credit factors that are going to be in a position to say there's so many dollars available to be able to farm that acre. And it's going to be up to the decision how many dollars perhaps can be used for the rent versus the non-rent items. But it's not a case where the banks are setting necessarily the rent levels that are getting paid in a particular marketplace. And the last thing is related to kind of best practices again. It's just trying to some way balance the short run needs and the long run benefits. What's sustainable? What could be done? What cannot be done? Many times the tenants, they're not unconcerned about practices in terms of long-term versus short-term. Many times there's as much benefit to them to be doing long-run decision-making in their decisions as well, even though the lease itself may only be 1 year, 3 years, whatever the case might be. But there's certainly benefits from their perspective as well. It's not just the landlord perhaps might be having long-term ideas in mind. It's just as important to the tenant. But the balance on the leasing side is trying to make a decision that they can reach some sort of an agreement that works. Again, lease minimums. Again, we want to make sure that we try to establish things like definitions of what to use, how the land's going to be used. Is there livestock involved? Is there certain requirements in terms of cropping patterns? It's certainly at a minimum. Again, as I've said already, I've kind of indicated a strong interest in having something in writing versus just verbally. But the bottom line is, at a minimum, they're trying to match whatever the landowner concerns might be with the tenant needs to be able to be successful, and then all in keeping with good sustainable farm practices. Okay. Now there's I don't know if you noticed the slide change from kind of best practices to the legal review. And I'm going to go over this is the perspective of just, we're getting to some of the legal related kind of points now. And I want to emphasize again, I'm not an attorney, and I encourage everybody on this call to make sure they have a good trusted attorney and run things by them when they get ready to make lease decisions. But certainly, first thing is it's applicable from state to state. Again, we've got some people on this call I know that are all not just in Iowa. That's certainly from my perspective. There's certainly from state to state certain mandatory things the state law has said versus of just discretionary items. For instance, termination requirements of a lease. What's required to terminate a lease in Iowa may be different than perhaps Illinois or Indiana or Wisconsin. So it's just something to be aware of. But it's critical that whatever the law is, that both the landlord and the tenant are understanding that. Again, presuming in some cases, in most cases, probably that neither one of them are perhaps are attorneys. Then you get into this issue of conservation. What kind of conservation points legally are going to want to be in that document? And largely what we're talking about conservation, wind, soil, water, we're talking about largely what's above the ground. Because again, right now, there is some very specific language in Iowa that if you do not talk about conservation above the ground decisions, the default is the tenant has that right. And it's probably not good to leave it silent in the state of Iowa. You want to define exactly what does that mean. But the above the ground plant does default to the tenant in terms of decision making. Certainly there's a decision on the legal side, and we don't have time to talk about taxes versus conservation, but there's rules that relate to that. You're going to want to be in a position where especially if you're making decisions about long-term decisions on conservation, be aware of what the tax consequences, both of the landlord side as the tenant side, especially as relates to, and certainly the short-run legal or tax decisions are a little easier to get your arms around, just because that's short-term, year-to-year tax decisions with your tax filing. But long-term, there might be some conservation decisions you're making that have tax implications that you want to be aware of. Okay. The conservation lease supplement is a very specific section that may not mean it's going to be defined specifically. If you look at some of the Iowa State University ag decision-making tools, it's defined there's sections, but I guess don't look at it as it might be some sort of an appendix or something like that. But it would relate to that from the standpoint of it's supplemental to the rest of the lease. And it's good for both the tenant and the landlord to always consider an attorney before they sign any business contract, especially as it relates to a lease. Now, I did mention about the Center for Ag Law and Taxation, and I'll just make mention of that again, just because it's so important. If you're in a position where you want to talk to an attorney, and you don't have a trusted attorney now, Center for Ag Law and Taxation is available. Again, you cannot put them on retention. They will not represent you in the court of law, but they are an attorney. They are qualified in the state of Iowa to give an attorney a legal opinion on if you're dealing with some sort of a legal matter associated with an ag lease. And then ag decision maker is, again, another resource available for you to perhaps make some decisions in terms of your actual lease components. Make up primarily, certainly the economics of it, but also the non-economic portions. Okay. Again, the last section I'm going to talk about, again, the next few minutes we have left, is this lease supplement. What about this lease as it relates to the conservation? Okay. Many of the things as we talk about the rest of the lease, it relates to this as well. But certainly, we're looking for a cooperation common arrangement between the landlord and the tenant. We want to have an eye for goal setting, both from the tenant and the landlord side. We want to seek win-win set of circumstances and that even in the conservation portion of the lease agreement. It's not going to be separate from that standpoint. It's got to be proactive in terms of many of the conservation practices that we're using. That they have a tail to them, so to speak. They're not just one time. Although we'll talk about some of the cropping practices in a minute, one year to year to year. There are certainly other parts of conservation that are very permanent, and they have more and more long-term implications to them. And then certainly from the standpoint, as we talked earlier, about the idea of sustaining things in the farm operation. Right now, because margins are tight like they are, that's perhaps something that needs to be talked about today more than ever before. It's just because of the environment. Yeah, we want to do these things, we want to make these conservation decisions, but we have to balance that because now we have to think about being able to farm another year because of the environment we're in right now. The tenant capabilities, much like the landlord capabilities we talked about, tenant capabilities, it's an environment of precision ag. Precision farming, things like I mentioned already, pesticide certifications, fertility decision-making, all of that all relates to who that tenant and how that, what the background of that tenant and what their background. It's going to be specific from tenant to tenant. It's going to be specific to the skills that they have, the machinery they have. Certainly risk-bearing right now, it's going to be specific to them because I mentioned earlier about the just in terms of what their balance sheet. Maybe they're going to need to look this year at a conservation environment that relates more to sharing some of the risks in some way. Because of maybe that's even specific to a cash lease rent, maybe a flex lease, because of the risk-bearing parts of the tenant capabilities that you're having to deal with. Cost sharing and rent adjustments, what we're talking about there is more of those long-term decisions. How are they going to get paid for? Who's going to pay them? Who's going to reimburse them? And this next point on exhausted value, as much as we talked about a long-term, 16, 17 years is some of the averages associated with that tenant relationship. Some cases now, because of the permanency of certain decisions that you're making in your conservation practices, what if the lease doesn't last as long as what the conservation practice was? So you want to make sure that you talk about that in your lease agreement as well. Certainly soil loss control, there's a place to be measuring things. Government regulations are going to require that in some instances, and so you want to be sensitive to that in terms of what your lease agreement says. You don't want to have a lease agreement that is in violation of some of those governmental regulations and requirements that are out there. The covenant of good husbandry. Let me just talk about that from the standpoint, first of all, Iowa, it's not applicable specifically in the state of Iowa, but it still has a lot of merit to put it in the lease. You don't want to leave it silent. In the state of Iowa, it defines what's called the duty of stewardship as opposed to good husbandry. Very, very similar to the same thing. But the point is, on the lease side, you're going to want to make sure you don't leave it silent. You want to express it in the lease agreement. You want to guard against harmful practices, both from the tenant and the landlord side. Crop residue, again, that's, as I mentioned just briefly earlier, that's a major part. We're talking again. We talked about organic matter already. In the state of Iowa, if the lease is silent, the tenant has the authority to decide what they're going to do. That's probably not the best thing for the landlord. So you're going to want to make sure you're making decisions in terms of what's your crop residue. And maybe that's as simple as defining very specifically. For instance, not unusual for a lease to say only 50% of the crop residue could be removed. But that's, again, the idea from a conservation standpoint, making a decision what you're going to want to have and have it being said very specifically in your lease arrangement. Good stewardship, again, as it relates to this idea of sustainability. The landlord certainly has a mandate as the owner of the land. Ultimately, they're the ones that are going to benefit the most from the asset when it's protected against deterioration. But from an ethical standpoint, when it comes to that second point, is there a place to be, only complying minimally with the ethical requirements? That's certainly one philosophy to have when it comes to what your good stewardship language should say in your lease agreement. Or to the extreme, maybe there's certainly some moderate level of ethical compliance, and then maybe the greater ability is the idea of making sure you're doing things above reproach, doing things that are doing it in the best possible way to be able to maintain the productivity, the capabilities of that lease arrangement of that land. The government programs, again, right now, if you're familiar at all with what's going on in Washington, and we know that the government right now, actually, I'm getting ready, Jen talked earlier about, I'm getting ready to do an Annie's project in Lyon County next week. My speakers that I bring in, 2 of them are typically from the government. And right now, we're not going to be able to have at least part of that group probably joining us because right now they're shut down. I think that's certainly a point to be made, but also at the same time, where there's government programs out there that are long-standing, that are out there for us to be able to help get that lease in compliance, keep it in compliance with what it talks about as it relates to both the USDA and NRCS requirements. It's alphabet soup a little bit, but CSP and EQIP, just 2 conservation-related government programs that you're going to want to talk about, be aware of, both as a landlord and as a tenant, as you relate that to the lease agreement. Soil loss limits. There are some very quantifiable soil loss limits, conservation plans that are in place. Again, you're not going to want a position where the lease doesn't comply with what those limitations are. If you're not familiar with it, if your land doesn't have a soil conservation plan, or if you're not familiar with it, it probably makes sense to have a discussion with NRCS and find out if one exists and what it does say, and then certainly to stay in compliance with it. And that relates indirectly then to things like what are the requirements relates to thresholds and monitoring of soil conservation losses. Last thing, and I'm going to go quickly now, there's cropping patterns. We just don't have time to talk about all those, but you're in a position where you're thinking short run, what you're going to do from year to year to year, to perhaps make best decisions on conservations, whether it's contouring, rotations, tillage, groundwater, et cetera, that are mentioned there. That's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but think crop year when you're making decisions in your lease and having your lease talk about what those practices are expected to be. And then the permanent practices, those ones are typically going to be something that you're going to do that's going to perhaps last more than just one crop year. Tiling terraces, waterways. Think in terms of, and again, this relates back to the tax point that I made earlier. They're probably going to have a longer term cost to them. Perhaps there are going to be some tax decisions you're going to make on that because it's going to involve more than one growing season. But just be aware of the practices that you might want to be, again, not meant to be exhaustive, but you perhaps there's a place in the lease supplement to talk about what practices are you going to be using to decide between the landlord and the tenant. Let me just summarize by saying this. There's certainly conservation practices have long-term and short-term implications to the soil, water, and crop productivities and quality. We talked about that. And then that lease can really go a long way to make it a better business relationship for everybody if you take the time to have a carefully structured lease that's advantageous to both the landlord and the tenant, a win-win environment for the landlord and the tenant. Okay, I didn't see any questions. Are there any questions out there now, though?
Yes, there are, Gary.
Okay, excellent.
So we'll get started. The first question is, what about soil fertility prior to lease and post-lease? Do you recommend pre- and post-soil testing?
Great question. Yes, the answer to the question directly, yes. I think there's, because of margin situations, again, we have what are sometimes referred to as gold diggers. And that's a case where somebody's willing to pay a little bit more for rent because they're going to cut the corners maybe someplace else, maybe because of their financial situation. There could be a lot of reasons why that might be. But long-term, having a soil sample test, and again, that doesn't necessarily mean every year. I think most people would suggest to you every 2 to 3 years, and then making sure that both what you find it and when you get the land, when you're in a leased environment for the first time, and when you leave it no worse off than when it was when you took the lease out the first year. And it should be right in your lease. It needs to be something that's right in it. Don't leave it silent. Talk about it very specifically in the lease.
Okay, next question is, are cover crops generally considered a conservation practice of the harvested crop or the crop planted into the cover crop? What about grazing the cover crop by the tenant, landowner, or even by a third party?
It depends. The answer is there's certainly cover crops that I'll say that their total purpose is to try to help with conservation. There may not be any livestock involved at all. We just don't have time to talk about the science side of that because there are now some pretty good science that relates to how the cover crop can actually be beneficial to the crop farming environment. On the livestock side, certainly there's economics out there right now that talk about there's paybacks from that. But just again, I'm going to have time to be able to totally talk about that, but there's certainly points to that need to be talked about before making decisions on cover crops.
Okay, and the next question is, how should soil loss be quantified?
Well, I mentioned earlier that there's perhaps a soil, an NRCS conservation plan and or a tillage limitation or soil loss limitation that's out there. That would probably be the first place. Use the government regulations that perhaps make sure we're in compliance with that. Beyond that, I did mention one of the slides about permanents, the bioreactors. There is some science out there that relates to being able to capture what's going on with erosion, both from the standpoint of quality of water, but also fertility loss and some of those other things, ag chemical things. But so there's two different ways you might be able to get to that is the practical side of it. And obviously, if you're out there driving around, even the person that's not well educated is going to be able to see where there's perhaps some practices that need to be redone or rethought because of the water, especially when the hilly environments in northwest Iowa, that could perhaps be taking organic matter off the soil, and you can see the erosion that's happening.
Okay, next question is, ag retailers like myself don't mind sharing information and ideas with our clients, but we can't get between the grower and their landlord. What do you see as our role in addressing problems in fields like erosion of tile blowouts, as well as adoption of conservation practices?
We have, I've actually had meetings in northwest Iowa where that tenant, landlord, and ag retailer will all come together to be able to talk about those very specific topics that you're talking about, whether it's tiling, whether it's other decision making that's happening. At the very least, I think there's a place for the retailer to be able to provide very quantifiable, economic-based, scientific-based information related to things like fertility, to weed management control. Some of those elements are very quantifiable, and I think at the very least, making that available to both the landlord and the tenant is probably the best situation that I see from that. But the retailer, because again, it's just like the landlord and the tenant, neither one may be attorneys. The retailer is very much in a position where they've got some very specific expertise that can really be helpful to that decision making and that negotiation that's going on.
Next question is, being a landowner with several tenants, I want to talk with my farmers about what needs they see to help improve the land. How can I afford to make physical improvements without passing some of the costs on to them?
First, I encourage you to, I like the first part of the question. I think there's a place for that conversation. Again, the good news is it sounds like there's a possibility that can physically be happening eye to eye with one another once or twice or three times during the year. And again, if that's what that person is saying, I certainly want to encourage that to where you can have that kind of a dialogue. I think the return on investment is the second part of the answer. I think, as the landowner, you're in a position where you've got to evaluate the asset. The value is yours. It's just like any other asset, whether it's your car you're putting a wax job on, or a house you're putting a new aluminum siding on. It's a case where you've got to make some decisions that are hopefully not allowing deterioration of the value of that land. And so that ROI decision has to be part of that perspective from your standpoint of making a decision as a landlord. The flip side of that is a tenant. It's got to be something that, in most cases, it's going to be equal. The short-term and long-term implications are going to be the same. But in some cases, because of the environment we're in right now, some of those costs may have to be shared in a different way to be able to economically justify, be able to take the practices, make the decisions that you want to make. There might be a place where someone, again, you got to take into consideration the tax implications to some of these things, but you've got to make a decision of perhaps is somebody going to be willing to pay for that? Maybe the return on that is then a longer term lease if it is a tenant that's paying for something. It can't be probably expected to pay for something with a long-term advantage when you only have perhaps a short-term lease, shorter than the life of the actual improvement you're making. So there's just a give and take that happens, a win-win that I talked about a couple times. It has to take place, but I think it has to start with trust, has to start with coming together and having that conversation as best you can early on, right now. Not waiting until March or April in Northwest Iowa, but it's a good time to be having those conversations right now.
Okay, great. And the last question is, as a grower, bringing up all the challenges that could or need to be made, I am worried about my rent increasing. Any ideas how to avoid this?
I am worried about it as well. I know that from the standpoint of the ability for the land to be able to pay the bills right now, because of margins as tight as they are right now, the first place you have to start is an analysis of your own operation and get an idea of where are your expenses, where both on the marketing side and on the production side, where is, and again, I use often in our discussion in this part of the world, enterprise discussion, enterprise analysis. And that means analysis by farm, by commodity, by lease, and then making a decision from that standpoint at that level of detail, determining, okay, what can I reasonably expect to generate for revenues, and what can I reasonably expect the expenses to be without making decisions to short run things, without making decisions to cutting back when fertility cutbacks are not justified. We're not justifying it with making some of those kind of decisions that are not necessarily in the best interest long term. But it has to be, and then you have to be in a position. I recently wrote something that you've got to be willing to make the tough decision. Is there a place where that land, based on the lease arrangement you're talking about entering into, is there a place you say it just won't work at that price? And again, I'm a farm kid. I know the concepts of giving up land. I know the concept of never being able to get it back. I understand that. But how deep is your balance sheet? Beyond the point of having a lender that's going to finance you or not, how deep is it? How much, especially age-wise right now, how much sense does it mean to be able to be making decisions to where you're going backwards with your net worth? If you're at a point where you're getting 3, 4, 5 years from retirement, if you're going backwards with your lease arrangement, is that the best decision that you could be making right now long term because of where you are just from the standpoint of retirement?
Okay. In the interest of time, I'd like to wrap up the Q&A. I want to thank Gary again for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your work.
Thank you for having me. And again, I definitely welcome any and all feedback. And as folks have a chance to get a hold of me, have them do that.
Okay. I'd like to acknowledge our funders and collaborators that made this webinar possible. In particular, the Great Lakes Protection Fund, American Farmland Trust, and the McKnight Foundation. I'd also like to thank PARM's premier egg retailer members, the Andersons, a gold member, and silver members, Guarantee Egg and Nutrient Egg Solutions. Their contributions help make this webinar possible and help promote the strides that egg retailers are making to reduce nutrient impairments. For more information on membership, contact our project manager, Caitlin at partnershipfarm.org. The PARM team also provides free resources for egg retailer employees, grower clients, and consultants available on our website, partnershipfarm.org. On the left is our continually updated and 4R approved agronomist handbook, available free for download. The handbook includes algal bloom updates, trends in customer product and service adoption, and fact sheets that you can provide to grower customers to increase awareness of products and services that reduce nutrient runoff. Our phosphorus loss reduction wallet cards are on the right, which can be ordered for free on our website as well. These are a great conversation starter with your customers and can also serve as handouts in meetings. To date, we have distributed more than 25,000. Please remember to take our survey. If you have not already received an email in the past week, look for the link in our follow-up email. Again, this survey is vital for our egg industry and your location. Let us help you boost your brand and communicate to important stakeholders and industry members what egg retailers are doing to improve water quality. Please note names and locations are kept anonymous in our aggregate survey reports. As we wrap up, please remember to look for the follow-up email in a few days with a webinar evaluation and webinar recording. If you submitted your CCA number at registration and are viewing this webinar live or the recording within 2 weeks of the original date, your CEUs will be automatically submitted. Only if you are watching the recording more than 2 weeks after the original broadcast date will you need to email Julia at partnershipfarm.org your CCA number to ensure your CEUs are submitted. I want to thank you all again for joining us today, and I hope you join us again for our next webinar at the end of January.